Sydney.
Eamon Waterford is the acting CEO of the Committee for Sydney. He's with me in Sydney alongside Larissa Berendt, who's host of Speaking Out on ABC Radio and professor at UTS. And, welcome to you two. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you.
Down there in Canberra is Paul Fletcher. He's the new Minister for Families and Social Services, moving on for his old portfolio of infrastructure. He's MP for Bradfield. If you live in parts of Sydney around St Ives, Pymble and Hornsby, he's your local member. If the rubbish bin is not picked up on a Friday, please ring Paul personally, because it's basically his fault. Paul,
you're absolutely right, Richard, it is. And I can tell you, like every MP, I get lots of those matters, and I always seek to deal with them as efficiently as I can.
You always say, it's the council, not me. Here's the number.
One of my jobs is to be, and all of my colleagues would say the same, is to be a postbox to help then put people in touch with who the right kind of government to deal with is.
Fair enough. Now, the PM has announced a Royal Commission into aged care ahead of tonight's Four Corners, revealing the dysfunction in the sector. Some say the required changes are already obvious. The sector needs mandated staffing levels. It needs more regulation, more oversight, more funding. So is an expensive Royal Commission really needed? Paul, I think this afternoon we've been talking to lots of people. Everyone knows that there's problems in the sector and that we need to change things. Staying still is not an option. But is a Royal Commission necessarily going to do enough good to make it worth the money?
Well, look, we certainly think there is an important case to have a Royal Commission. We've seen significant increases in the number of reports going to the Aged Care Quality Agency of serious risk. Those cases have risen from 2 in 2015 to 61 a couple of years later. And as our new Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, wanted to be assured that these weren't just isolated cases, wanted to have a very thorough, careful look to see if there is a systemic problem. Look, as the Prime Minister told the Australian people yesterday, there are some very troubling instances that have been reported. We've had in South Australia, the Oakton Aged Care Facility being closed, and some terrible reports of the kind of treatment that occurred there. And so the Morrison government has made a judgment that we think this is an issue of sufficient importance that a Royal Commission is necessary. Bear in mind that the population over 85 is going to nearly quadruple over the next 4 decades. So it's so important that we do everything we can to get this right now.
Labor said today that you've cut more than $1 billion out of the sector. In fact, Scott Morrison did this as Treasurer.
Well, look, funding to the aged care system is rising and has been rising. What we want to do, though, is have a careful and thorough look at the quality of care being provided in residential and home aged care. That will also include, incidentally, having a look at the issue of young Australians with disabilities living in residential aged care settings. Of course, separately, we've got a lot of work underway with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which does include new housing options for many people with a disability. But there's a huge amount of funding going into aged care. In fact, it's at record levels. In 2017-18, aged care spending is estimated to be at $18.6 billion, and it'll grow by $5 billion over the next 5 years. So there's a lot of money going in there, but we're talking about how older Australians are treated. We have seen very troubling reports of poor treatment, and we want to have a thorough and careful look at this. This is so important that we're determined to look at this very carefully, and that's why Prime Minister Morrison has announced this Royal Commission into aged care.
Yeah, Larissa Berendt, no one, I think, thinks that things should stay as they are, but is a Royal Commission the answer?
Look, you can't take them lightly because they're very expensive and they shouldn't be used to deal with an immediate political problem. I think the Royal Commission into trade unions was probably an example of when they're done badly. But
and the pink bats one, some said was reeked of politics.
But I feel like this is an issue that is deserving of it. They've had a lot of reports into the sector and not a lot of movement. And I think it's a sort of area where to really get some institutional cultural change, you need to really be hearing the stories, which we've seen similarly in the Banking Royal Commission, also in the Royal Commission into institutional child sexual abuse. And I would also say, I don't think there was much that came out of the Royal Commission into protection and detention of children in the Northern Territory that wasn't already known through previous investigations. But refocusing the spotlight, allowing people to tell their stories and thinking about deeper institutional responses was a really good thing. And I think we're in the same space in this area.
Is there wisdom within the Indigenous community about how to better deal with aged care?
It's a very
particular to that community?
It's a very interesting issue in our community, and we recently had a report that looked at the legacy of intergenerational trauma caused by stolen generations. Culturally, our community is very reluctant to put people into nursing homes, so support to keep people in their homes is really important. And
which I should say, just to give a nod to the government, they have been doing quite a bit in terms of funding people's ability to stay at home.
That's right, and I think that's a very important strategy for our community. And similarly, what's come out of this other report is that when you've got people who've been institutionalised as children, looking at options that are alternatives to institutional care when they're older is something that's really important.
Because it's going to chime with really bad experiences from their childhood.
So those sorts of things, I think, are important solutions and have certainly made a big difference to the Indigenous community.
Eamon, we've spent all the afternoon being pretty shocked by the stuff we've found out already. Is the Royal Commission, though, going to help?
I think Larissa's right in the sense that in this circumstance, it's unlikely we're going to get a lot of new recommendations that we didn't already have a feeling about. But what a Royal Commission does that's really crucial is it raises public profile in a major way. And Australians are not very good at planning for old age, planning for frailty. So I would hope that a Royal Commission, in a way that a slightly more wonky, slightly more sort of hard to understand for the general public inquiry might not achieve that cut through to people to actually have a conversation with their loved ones to say, look, this is how I want to age, this is how I want to do it well. And maybe as a community, we might also have a conversation about other ways we can help shape our cities, our towns, our communities so that they're age-friendly and that they'll actually be ready for people as the population
Okay, I mean,
gets
this
older.
is your expertise around town planning. What are the issues for a place like Sydney where land is so expensive in terms of having a nursing home where you can be close to the people you've grown up with? Yeah,
so that is one of the huge problems is we're not planning for the number of aged care facilities we're going to require and indeed retirement homes and a whole spectrum of ageing type buildings, but we're also not building the houses that we build for all ages that are there for people to get older in. So we often put staircases into, narrow apartments that are actually quite difficult for older people to get around. We build walk-ups, we build spaces that are not necessarily age-friendly or the types of things that you can downgrade and stay in the same space. So you might...
So when you're building a new building right now, you should be thinking about how would this convert to somebody who's got some movement issues?
Yeah, so a great example would be, and we're starting to see a very, very small amount of this, you might have a 3-bedroom apartment or a 3-bedroom house that's able to be converted over time into a couple of smaller apartments. As somebody says, well, I've no longer got kids at home, I don't need the extra bedrooms, and actually the extra space is a bit hard for me to keep up with.
They come back, Eamon, though. Eamon, they come back.
Well, then they can stay in the granny flat, the other apartment, and they can
Mine turned up last night, only for the night, but still. Tomato dinner. It's 9 p.m.
Can I just jump in?
Yes,
Royal
Paul.
Commission.
From Canberra, just make one quick observation. Look, there is so much great care being provided in the aged care sector, so many very hardworking and very committed staff, nurses and others. I see that in the aged care facilities I go into in my own electorate. I see wonderful care being given. I saw it when my dad was in an aged care facility in Brown Street in Paddington, Presbyterian aged care as it happened. Classic story. My mum had to find the place for him quickly. They gave him great care. They were very compassionate, looked after him very well for the last few weeks of his life, and as a family we were very happy. And I think lots of Australians have that story, but at the same time there is enough evidence, troublingly, of serious issues, and so much is at stake for all of us as we contemplate. It's a stage of life we all inevitably come to. It is so important. That's why Prime Minister Morrison has taken the view we can't just walk by this, we need to engage in it.
And look, I think it's important when we watch Four Corners tonight to remember those two things. One, that there are some good stories there. They might not focus on those tonight because why would you, but there are some good stories. And secondly, let's not blame the staff. In the situations where there are no staff, so few staff being rostered, they cannot do what they would need to do. That's not their fault.
Indeed.
Eamon Waterford is here, Paul Fletcher and Larissa Barron. Now, a music festival in Sydney leaves 2 people dead after suspected drug overdoses, 3 more in a critical condition in hospital, with hundreds more treated by medical staff at the festival. The Premier says she will do everything in her power to shut down this festival, not let it happen again. but has affirmed that she remains an opponent of allowing pill testing at such festivals, saying it gives a green light to drug use. Has she got a point, or should we examine what has happened in Canberra, for instance, where they have had a trial of pill testing at a music festival? Larissa?
Well, I think drug testing is a sensible idea that reflects the reality that a significant minority of people, particularly younger people, will take recreational drugs at some point during their lives. I don't think it's the same as legalising drugs, although obviously there are good arguments as to why you should treat this as a medical and not a criminal matter. But I think that it does accept that drug testing, that drugs will be taken and we can minimise harm. I kind of think that usually it's better to, rather than zero tolerance and banning, to heavily regulate so we've got more control. And given that this does affect primarily young people who might make a bad decision about taking recreational drugs in these kind of contexts, I sort of think that the idea of the testing is good, but I do appreciate for a Premier that there would be political issues around this that would make it very difficult to take that approach.
Although the ACT government's given permission for the trial. And, you know, some people, though, say, look, that's a weird message to send to young people. You've got the police outside with the sniffer dogs and the, you know, and the searches and all that. Zero tolerance at the boundary. And then once you get in, suddenly you've got kindly medical staff helping you test them.
I sort of struggle with this too, because we take this line on recreational drugs, but we don't with alcohol, which is just as damaging for young people and older people. You know, we have a lot of grey lines. We draw a lot of lines in the sand that don't make any sense. So, you know, I think in some ways it might be a mixed message, but if we know that people are going to do this, I think that at least making sure, particularly, I mean, I think that for me, one of the things is that it is primarily young people in these kind of contexts who are making these decisions. Not bad people, but people who'll make this kind of decision. And minimising harm to them, I think, is important.
Paul Fletcher, is this just a case of minimising harm? After all, Australia had this debate during the HIV crisis, and we kind of led the world by saying, okay, we don't think it's a great idea for people to take heroin. Of course we don't. But on the other hand, we will provide these needle exchanges which will minimise harm. And indeed, it turns out, now we look at it a few decades on, it saved thousands and thousands of lives. Isn't that what we should be looking at this time around?
Well, I think it's a very dangerous message to be saying to people, look, come to this music festival and there'll be pill testing available. I think that is effectively saying to people, oh, look, don't worry about it. It's safe, it's fine, and it's not. It's very dangerous. The drugs are produced, you know, brought in by criminal syndicates. There's no such thing as a safe drug. Let's bear in mind that in addition to, tragically, the two young people who died over the weekend, there was another death at this festival in 2013 and another in 2015. So this is very, very dangerous, and I'm very much with the Premier on this. I think to have a message that says, oh well, we're going to have drug testing here, and give the impression that there's some safe way to do this, I don't think there is.
Is it normalising drug use, or is it medicalising drug use? You know, you're in the festival, you've got your 3 ecstasy tablets or whatever, you go up to this table, I presume, you've got it's manned by nurses and doctors, you hand the things over and they say to you, look, yeah, this is ecstasy, you're right, but it's mixed in with a whole lot of bleach. I really wouldn't take this if I were you. Or alternatively, this one's MDM, whatever it's called, but it's an incredibly strong version of it. You know, you'd have to be incredibly cautious in taking. That's an advantage on not having that information at all, isn't it?
I think it's simply far too dangerous to be suggesting to people there is a safe way of taking what are illegal drugs brought into Australia by criminal syndicates. I think you're sending a terribly mixed message, and it's not something that I would support.
A mixed message? Is that right, Eamon?
Well, I think zero tolerance really only works as a message if, in fact, it's successful. And the reality is people are taking drugs at these festivals. People are dying at these festivals, as Paul noted. A number of people have died over the last few years. Clearly, zero tolerance is not stopping people taking drugs. The sniffer dogs are doing a relatively average job. They're stopping a lot of people, and only about a third of them actually have drugs on them, and clearly a whole bunch of other drugs are getting through. If that is the case, all the evidence that we've seen from around the world on how other cities and how other countries deal with this is they have harm minimisation policies, and pill testing is one of those.
Well, it's becoming quite common in Europe, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a
England
very common thing. I mean, in a place where recreational drug use is a slightly more normalised thing than it is in Australia. But I think when we take a festival like DEFCON 1, which is, trance music, it's not really as though the harm minimisation the zero tolerance don't take drugs messages getting through to these people.
Okay, but you say in places in Europe drug use is more normalised. That's what we want to avoid, though, isn't it? We want to protect people but not say, wink, wink, it's actually really normal, and in fact you're a bit weird if you come here and you're not on drugs.
Well, here's where we get into the interesting conversation about alcohol as a drug, cigarettes as a drug. The number of people dying from all recreational drugs when you include alcohol is far higher per population in Australia than it is in countries in Europe. The drug use styles are slightly different, but ultimately people are safer there.
All right, it's 8 minutes to 6, the Monday Political Forum. Eamon Waterford is here from the Committee for Sydney, so is Paul Fletcher, he's the Minister for Families and Social Services, and Larissa Berend, who's a Professor at UTS and host of our own Speaking Out program. Let's check the traffic.
Traffic, ABC Radio Sydney.
At Carlingford, Pennant Hills Road at Adderton Road, a truck breakdown there. Significant delays are being recorded southbound. At Chatswood, Pacific Highway at Mackintosh Street, a car breakdown there. One southbound lane is closed. And at Ramsgate, Rocky Point Road at Margate Street, a motorcycle accident has knocked out one southbound lane. And finally at Warwick Farm, Hume Highway at Governor Macquarie Drive, a car breakdown eastbound. Now, some members of the Liberal Party have turned against Tony Abbott, trying to prevent his pre-selection in the seat he's held for a quarter of a century. The theory is that Mr Abbott's role in the recent parliamentary spill has not resonated well with local voters, leaving the seat vulnerable to a campaign from a high-profile independent. A chance that may yet be seen in Wentworth, I guess. Is it fanciful to imagine that the Liberal Party could ever lose its grip on Warringah, one of the classic blue ribbon seats? Or are some parties right to be concerned? Paul Fletcher.
Well, look, the first thing I'd say is any seat held by any party can always be at risk of going to an independent or somebody from another party. Look, think about North Sydney, which many people would see as a classic blue ribbon Liberal seat, but that was held by Ted Mack for quite a number of years. So it is certainly always prudent for any politician and any political party to recognise that no party, no politician has some kind of automatic entitlement to a particular electorate. It's a contestable, competitive process. That's as it should be in our democracy.
Okay, but are they right to be worried about this particular candidate, one called Tony Abbott?
Well, look, Tony is obviously a very high-profile, very well-known local member in Warringah, as well as having had a very distinguished career. I will leave it for locals in Warringah to comment on that. I see Tony, working hard in the Parliament, but I'm not.
You were aghast by that spill, Paul, weren't you?
Well, it's a matter of public record that I supported Malcolm Turnbull at every opportunity that week, and that was the choice I made. We now, of course, have a new Prime Minister, a new Deputy Leader. We've got a great team in Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg, and we're focused on the outcomes that Australians expect us to be focused on.
Okay, but even there may be lots of Australians in Warringah and elsewhere who think the new Prime Minister is terrific. They still don't agree with what happened, though. They don't agree with the spill and the wastage of political time and energy on it.
Look, certainly for people who follow politics closely, this has attracted excitement and interest. It's worth bearing in mind that the majority of people perhaps don't follow politics all that closely, but what they do expect is their government to get on with delivering outcomes for them. And
exactly, and that was our problem with it.
Well, the best way that we demonstrate that we are doing the things that the people expect us to be doing is to get on and do them rather than talking about going-ons in Canberra and talking about ourselves. We need to be focused on issues like aged care, because this is what is going to affect lots of people, is affecting lots of people right now. Issues like the employment level and generating more jobs, issues like in my portfolio, social services. That's what we've got to be focused on.
Eamon, could it be that after 25 years, Mr Abbott could be a liability rather than an asset in Warringah?
Well, I'm not sure if the rot set in just at the spill a couple of weeks ago, which many of us, as you know, were fairly aghast at. I think Tony Abbott has not kept to his promise to not be a wrecker, not be a sniper, etc., etc. And I think that might be starting to catch up with him. At the same time, when we had the same-sex marriage plebiscite, we noted that 75% of his electorate voted yes, and he was one of the most outspoken advocates for no. And, you know, all credit to a local member that stands up for their values and takes that to their electorate. But I think that there's a couple of early warning signs that were creeping in long before last week.
Larissa, what about this idea that Mr Abbott is going to be an envoy to Indigenous Australia? Is that a good idea?
Well, let me just echo the words of Jackie Huggins, who I think spoke for many people when she said, after colonisation, disease, dispossession, stolen generations and consequent impact on Indigenous poverty, life expectancy and life chances, surely we've suffered enough. and basically going to the fact that I'm not sure Tony Abbott's track record on Indigenous issues is any better than it was as Minister for Women. What I would say is we spoke earlier about how the government had done some very good work in the area of aged care in relation to the Indigenous community. And a lot of that's been driven by a wonderful member of the government, Ken Wyatt. Mm-hmm. He is an Aboriginal man who brings a wealth of experience on Indigenous policy, particularly because of his own work in Indigenous health. And I think that's the sort of advice that the Prime Minister should be looking for. And it's the sort of advice that echoes with the Indigenous community, and there should be more of that.
Three cheers to Ken Wyatt.
Three cheers to Ken Wyatt.
Eamon Waterford is here, Paul Fletcher and Larissa Barron. Now, last week, a 6-year-old girl called Harper Nielsen got in all sorts of trouble for taking a stand against the national anthem, which she believes explicitly ignores the role of Indigenous Australians. Part of the case against her from people like Pauline Hanson was that she must be parroting her parents' views, since 9-year-olds are not interested in such matters. So here's my question. What were you interested in when you were 9 years old? And based on the kids you know, do any of them have an interest in what could be broadly called politics? Paul Fletcher.
Well, based on some of the 9-year-olds that I get to speak to as a Member of Parliament, 2 standout questions I've received that stick in my mind. Number one, Mr Fletcher, isn't it the case that we're in a safe seat so we don't get as many projects from Canberra, which I suspect did come from that child's parents? And then the other question, well, Mr Fletcher, if you've got 4 minutes in a division to get to the chamber, what happens if you're on the toilet?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah. And why hasn't the garbage bin been picked up?
Yeah, I do ask about that.
Larissa Barron, what were you like when you were 9?
As you to know, I was very precocious. I think my mother would laugh at any idea she had any influence over me, but I did grow up in a very politically active home. My mother, very strong on women's rights. Dad, of course, very strong on Indigenous rights. I thought everyone marched on a Saturday saying, what do we want, land rights, and do we want it now? Came as a shock that wasn't normal. So that kind of shaped me. I was very pleased that my 11-year-old nephew participated in a debate for Indigenous students across the southeast of Sydney recently, and he gave a little speech at Parliament House, which he wrote himself.
Oh, okay.
And he said it was very important to stand up for yourself, stand up for what you believe in, and stand up for people who can't stand up for themselves. So I felt like the future was in good hands.
All right, don't underestimate the 9 to 11-year-olds. Hey, we're out of time, but thank you to Larissa Barron from UTS and from our own Speaking Out program. Paul Fletcher there in Canberra, MP for Bradfield. Thanks, Paul. And with me also in Sydney, Eamon Waterford from the Committee for Sydney. Thank you very much. Coming